Yeah, so I'm listening to pop radio, playing pop gigs at age 14 and 15, but I'm listening to jazz every day after school. So all of those things were what I liked.
Larry Carlton's name is etched into music history, a guitarist whose tone alone could make a song immortal. For decades, he was the man behind the curtain, an architect of some of the most iconic recordings of the 20th century. From the slick perfection of Steely Dan to the jazz brilliance of the Crusaders, from Joni Mitchell's poetic landscapes to his own dazzling solo work, Carlton's fingerprints are everywhere. But now, at 77, his story takes on a new weight. He's lived through triumphs, tragedies, and transformations few could imagine. And when you see him today, you may not just recognize a legend, you may gasp at the resilience, the scars, and the sheer survival etched into the man behind the guitar. Larry Eugene Carlton was born in 1948 in Torrance, California, a modest suburb that hardly hinted at the role he would play in reshaping modern music. By the time most kids were still fumbling with baseball mitts, Larry was already captivated by the 6 strings of a guitar. At 6 years old, he began learning the basics, inspired by his mother's love for music and the jazz sounds that filled their home. Unlike many players who learned by rote, Carlton approached the instrument with a kind of innate curiosity. He listened obsessively to records by Joe Pass, Wes Montgomery, and Barney Kessel, soaking in their phrasing and harmonic sophistication. By his teenage years, he wasn't just playing, he was interpreting. He had an ear for melody that made him sound older than his years, a gift that would eventually make him invaluable to recording studios searching for magic. Carlton's rise was rapid. In high school, he was already playing in local bands, dazzling audiences with a tone that seemed to sing rather than shout. He enrolled at Cal State Long Beach and immersed himself in both classical and jazz theory, determined to bridge the gap between the technical and the emotional. His dedication was relentless. Hours of practice weren't a chore, they were a necessity, a hunger he couldn't quiet. By the late 1960s, his reputation had begun to spread beyond local circles. Producers and arrangers took notice of the young guitarist who could shift seamlessly from bebop runs to soulful blues bends, from intricate jazz chords to crisp pop riffs. He wasn't just versatile, he was transformative. When Carlton touched a track, it sounded elevated, polished, alive. This was the moment when the recording industry was entering a golden age, and Los Angeles was its epicenter. Session musicians were in high demand, and Carlton, still barely in his 20s, found himself at the right place at the right time. Soon, his phone was ringing with offers that would thrust him into studios alongside legends. What set him apart wasn't just skill, it was instinct. Carlton had a way of finding the emotional core of a song instantly. Producers marveled at how he could walk into a room, hear a half-finished track, and in minutes deliver a guitar line that sounded like it had always belonged there. It wasn't long before people stopped asking if Larry Carlton could deliver, and started asking when he was available. The prodigy from Torrance was no longer just a local talent. He was becoming a force of nature in the music world, a guitarist whose sound would quietly shape the very soundtrack of an era. And soon, the phone call would come that would change everything. Before Larry Carlton became a household name among guitar aficionados, he was already a familiar presence in millions of homes. You just didn't know it. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Carlton built his career not just through albums, but through jingles. From television commercials to radio spots, his guitar was the hidden thread that tied together the sound of American advertising. Companies wanted familiarity, warmth, something that stuck in your head, and Carlton's tone delivered it perfectly. Jingles were a proving ground. They demanded precision, adaptability, and speed. Carlton would walk into a studio, be handed a chart, and within minutes deliver a take that satisfied both the composer and the client. There was no room for hesitation. In that environment, Carlton honed the skills that would make him invaluable in bigger sessions. Timing, tone, versatility. He mastered them all under the pressure of deadlines and the watchful eyes of producers who demanded nothing less than perfection. But even as he was becoming a go-to player for commercial work, Carlton was carving his path into the world of serious music. His reputation grew in Los Angeles, and he soon became one of the most sought-after session guitarists in the business.
You're under suspicion.
By the early 1970s, his resume was staggering. Joni Mitchell, Billy Joel, Quincy Jones, Michael Jackson. He could shift from folk to funk to fusion in the span of a single week. It was around this time that Carlton's work with the Crusaders catapulted him into another league. The jazz-funk group found in him not just a guitarist, but a collaborator who could weave jazz sophistication into grooves that resonated with a wide audience. His solos, lyrical and fluid, added depth and color to their sound. Tracks like Scratch and Spiral carried his unmistakable fingerprint, earning him the nickname Mr. 335, after his beloved Gibson ES-335 guitar. This period was one of relentless activity. Carlton was recording constantly, often juggling multiple sessions in a single day. Yet despite the grind, he thrived. Where other musicians might have burned out, Carlton seemed fueled by the challenge. Each session was an opportunity to learn, to experiment, to refine his artistry. And then came the legends. His phone rang with invitations to join projects that would define an era. Steely Dan, Joni Mitchell, Quincy Jones. They didn't just want a guitarist, they wanted Larry Carlton. His reputation for delivering brilliance under pressure had spread across the industry, and soon he would be asked to step into the most demanding sessions of his career. Looking back, it's almost shocking to realize how much of our collective musical memory was shaped by those years of Carlton's playing. From jingles to jazz, from pop hits to iconic solos, his guitar was everywhere. He was the invisible giant of the industry, shaping songs while the spotlight shone on others. But soon, the spotlight would find him, and the world would never forget his name. It was the mid-1970s when the call came, a call that would forever tie Larry Carlton's name to one of the most enigmatic and revered bands in rock history, Steely Dan. By then, the duo of Walter Becker and Donald Fagen had already built a reputation for being uncompromising perfectionists, notorious for cycling through dozens of session players until they found the exact sound they wanted. To be summoned into their studio was both an honor and a trial by fire. Carlton, by that time, was already one of Los Angeles's most in-demand guitarists, but even he felt the weight of expectation as he walked into the studio. Steely Dan wasn't just another gig, this was a crucible where even the most seasoned musicians could be broken. The session that cemented his place in music history was for The Royal Scam in 1976. Becker and Fagen wanted a guitar solo for the track Kid Charlemagne, a song already simmering with funk and complexity. They gave Carlton the simplest of instructions: play something that fit, something that told a story. What happened next was pure alchemy. Carlton plugged in his Gibson ES-335, closed his eyes, and let instinct take over. Take after take, he explored melodies, bends, and runs, searching for the perfect arc. Hours passed. Becker and Fagen, characteristically silent, listened, nodded, and asked him to continue. Carlton felt the pressure mounting. Every note could be the one that defined or destroyed his career. And then it happened. On one take, Carlton unleashed a solo that was fluid, fiery, and unforgettable. It climbed, soared, and resolved with the kind of emotional punch that made listeners' hearts catch in their throats. The room went still. Even Becker and Fagen, men rarely moved to open praise, knew they had captured lightning. That's it, they said. The solo would remain on the record unchanged. That moment changed everything. The solo on Kid Charlemagne is now considered one of the greatest guitar solos ever recorded, ranked alongside the work of legends like Clapton and Hendrix. For Carlton, it was both a blessing and a burden. It elevated him into the pantheon of guitar gods, but it also tied him forever to a single moment, a single track, a single night in a studio where genius and obsession collided. The day Steely Dan came calling was the day Larry Carlton's life shifted from being the man behind the curtain to being part of rock history itself. At 77, he looks back on that moment with awe and humility.
Then about 8 years ago, I got a call from Steely Dan wanting to know if I would guest on eight shows with them.
But also with the scars of knowing how much it cost to create something that sounded so effortless. The solo on Kid Charlemagne didn't just earn Larry Carlton respect among peers, it became a cultural touchstone. Critics and guitarists alike hailed it as a masterclass in phrasing, tone, and storytelling. It wasn't about speed or flash, it was about voice. Every bend, every slide, every note seemed to carry intention, as though Carlton was speaking directly to the listener through 6 strings. But what the world heard as effortless was anything but. The session had been grueling, with Becker and Fagen's perfectionism weighing on every take. Carlton later admitted that by the time he delivered the now famous solo, he wasn't thinking, he was surviving. His fingers moved as though detached from his body, guided by instinct rather than conscious thought. When it was over, he felt drained, almost hollow, unsure whether he had done enough. Becker and Fagen's approval, rare and understated, was his only confirmation that something extraordinary had just been captured. When The Royal Scam was released in 1976, the response was electric. Fans couldn't get enough of the slick grooves and biting lyrics, but for guitar players, it was Carlton's solo that stole the show. Music magazines dissected it note by note, transcriptions circulated among students, and suddenly, Carlton was a household name in guitar circles. Yet fame was never his goal. He was, at heart, a session man, happiest in the studio, happiest when his guitar served the song. The irony was not lost on him. The solo that defined his career was one he hadn't written, one born out of exhaustion and relentless pressure. To this day, Carlton acknowledges the paradox. He's proud of it, humbled by it, but also haunted by the intensity of what it took to create. Still, the impact was undeniable. Kid Charlemagne elevated Carlton into the elite echelon of session musicians. He became not just a player for hire, but a legend in his own right. And while Steely Dan moved on to other guitarists and other solos, Larry Carlton's contribution stood like a monument, timeless, untouchable, and immortal. For the rest of his career, audiences would request it, fans would praise it, and fellow guitarists would study it. And though Carlton recorded thousands of other tracks, worked with hundreds of other artists, one truth remained. When history looked back at Larry Carlton, it would always begin with Kid Charlemagne. By the late 1970s, Larry Carlton was at the height of his powers. He was working with the Crusaders, recording his own solo projects, and still in demand as one of the premier session guitarists in Los Angeles. But in 1988, everything nearly ended in a single night of violence. Carlton was at his home studio in Southern California when a stranger appeared at the door. Accounts vary, but what is clear is that the encounter turned deadly within seconds. The intruder shot him in the neck at point-blank range, the bullet tearing through his vocal cords and lodging near his spine. For most people, it would have been fatal. For Carlton, it was the beginning of a nightmare. He was rushed to the hospital, his life hanging by a thread. Surgeons fought not only to save him, but to preserve the mobility of his hands, his livelihood, his identity. The damage was severe. He lost the ability to sing, and for a time, it seemed uncertain whether he would ever play guitar again.
You lost a vocal cord?
Yeah, the use of my left vocal cord is permanently gone.
The road to recovery was long and brutal. Carlton endured multiple surgeries, months of physical therapy, and endless pain. Friends and fellow musicians rallied around him, but the uncertainty was suffocating. The man who had delivered one of the most iconic guitar solos in history now struggled just to hold his instrument. And yet, he refused to give up. With patience and determination, he began to retrain his hands, relearning the guitar note by note, chord by chord. Progress was slow, but his resilience was extraordinary. Within a year, he was back on stage, playing with a depth and emotion that reflected his near-death experience.
So it's different. I have all of the responsibility, which means all of the glory, or...
The shooting changed him, but it did not break him. In fact, Many fans and critics argue that Carlton's playing after 1988 carried even greater power. His tone was richer, his phrasing more deliberate, his solos infused with a sense of gratitude for simply being alive. The night that nearly ended his career became, paradoxically, the night that gave his music new life. Carlton emerged not just as a survivor, but as a symbol of resilience, a man whose guitar spoke louder than any tragedy could silence. Even before the shooting, Larry Carlton was carving out a new identity beyond the studio. By the early 1980s, he had begun focusing more on his solo career, eager to step out from the shadows of other artists and showcase his own voice. With albums like Larry Carlton and Sleepwalk, he proved that he was more than a session ace. He was an artist in his own right. His solo work blended jazz, blues, and pop into a sound that was uniquely his. Smooth yet intricate, accessible yet sophisticated, it appealed to both casual listeners and serious musicians. Tracks like Room 335 became staples, not just of his catalog, but of the jazz fusion genre itself.
And enjoy it without having to pay through the nose. And what they did is they flew out from Korea.
Carlton also found success as a live performer. Unlike the sterile intensity of studio sessions, the stage gave him freedom. He improvised, interacted with audiences, and allowed his personality to shine through his guitar. Fans who knew him only as the ghost behind Steely Dan or Joni Mitchell suddenly saw him as a frontman, a storyteller in his own right. The transition wasn't without challenges. For years, Carlton had been the man producers called to save a track, the invisible genius who added magic without demanding attention. Stepping into the spotlight required a new kind of courage. He had to build his own following, tour under his own name, and take ownership of every success and failure. But Carlton rose to the challenge. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, he released a string of acclaimed albums, collaborated with giants like Robben Ford and Lee Ritenour, and won multiple Grammy Awards. He became not just a session legend, but a respected solo star. The shooting in 1988 threatened to derail all of it, but his return to the stage only reinforced his reputation. Fans who saw him play after his recovery witnessed not just technical brilliance, but raw human resilience. His concerts became more than performances. They became testaments to survival. By the time he entered his 60s, Carlton had achieved something rare. He had conquered the studio, the stage, and the shadows of tragedy. He was no longer just the guitarist behind Kid Charlemagne. He was Larry Carlton, a name synonymous with mastery, perseverance, and artistry. The shooting in 1988 should have ended Larry Carlton's career. In fact, doctors initially told him he would likely never regain full use of his left arm, the very limb that allowed him to weave melodies and solos that defined a generation of music. The bullet had shredded nerves, paralyzed vocal cords, and left him fighting not only for his livelihood, but for his life itself. Yet Carlton refused to accept defeat. After the immediate danger passed, his recovery became a battle of willpower. For months, he sat with a guitar in his lap, hands trembling as he tried to coax sound from the strings. The simplest chord progressions felt like insurmountable mountains, but he climbed them, one note at a time. Slowly, painfully, his fingers began to remember what his mind never forgot. The experience deepened his connection to music. Carlton began to see each note not just as sound, but as survival. He wasn't playing for fame anymore, or even for the approval of fans. He was playing because he had to, because the guitar was the lifeline that tethered him to hope.
So those are vibratos I use while bending notes. When I end on a note and I have not bent to that note.
When he finally returned to the stage, audiences wept. Here was a man who had been shot, nearly silenced forever, now pouring his soul into his instrument with more passion than ever before. His phrasing became more deliberate, his tone richer, his music infused with gratitude. Carlton himself admitted later that the shooting changed him, not just as a guitarist, but as a man. He learned humility, patience, and a profound respect for life's fragility. Critics noticed the shift, too. Albums released after his recovery carried a new emotional depth. Fans heard not just notes, but lived experience in every bend and vibrato. Carlton had always been admired as a technician, but now he was revered as a survivor, whose music carried the weight of scars turned into beauty. The bullet didn't stop him. In many ways, it set him free. Larry Carlton was no longer just the guitar genius behind other people's hits. He was living proof that resilience could turn tragedy into triumph, and his guitar became the voice of that victory. The 1990s brought a new chapter for Larry Carlton. Having proven that he could overcome the shooting, he began to reinvent himself, not as the invisible session man or even the wounded survivor, but as a full-fledged solo artist and band leader. His tours grew in scale, drawing fans who wanted to see not just the man who had played with Steely Dan or Joni Mitchell, but the man whose own catalog had blossomed into something extraordinary. Tracks like Room 335 and Sleepwalk became live staples, each performance different, each solo a fresh conversation with the audience. Carlton also embraced collaborations. In 1995, he joined forces with Robben Ford, another guitar powerhouse, for a tour and recording that showcased two masters trading lines like heavyweight fighters, only instead of blows, they exchanged fluid, soulful riffs. Later, he teamed up with Lee Ritenour, a partnership that further cemented his reputation as a guitarist capable of elevating any project. This era also saw him stepping into educational roles. Carlton began giving master classes, teaching younger players not just how to play guitar, but how to speak through it. His lessons were about more than scales and theory. They were about emotion, patience, and respect for the craft. Musicians left his workshops not just better players, but better listeners. And then came the accolades. Carlton won multiple Grammy Awards, recognition that placed him firmly in the pantheon of greats. But even with trophies on the shelf, he remained grounded. His humility and soft-spoken nature endeared him to fans and colleagues alike. Unlike many virtuosos, Carlton never let ego dominate his playing. For him, the music always came first. By the time he entered the new millennium, Carlton had successfully reinvented himself. He was no longer defined solely by the Steely Dan solo, the Crusaders, or the shooting. He was Larry Carlton, survivor, soloist, mentor, and master of the guitar. And though his career had already spanned decades, it was clear he wasn't finished yet. Today, at 77, Larry Carlton carries a legacy that few musicians can claim. He has played on more than 3,000 recording sessions, lent his guitar to some of the most iconic songs of the 20th century, won multiple Grammys, and inspired countless guitarists who consider him a beacon of taste, tone, and technique. But his legacy isn't just about numbers or accolades, it's about resilience. He survived the brutal gauntlet of Steely Dan sessions where lesser musicians cracked under pressure. He survived the music industry's fickleness, moving from jingles to jazz to rock without losing his identity. Most of all, he survived a bullet that nearly ended it all, transforming tragedy into a new chapter of artistry.
And I think the thing that turned me on to that kind of bending technique was listening to steel guitar players.
Fans who see him today often remark on how little he seems to have slowed down. His hands, though weathered by age, still move across the fretboard with grace. His tone, warm, fluid, unmistakably Larry, remains intact, the product of decades of mastery. He may not sprint across stages like he once did, but his presence commands attention, his guitar doing the heavy lifting of expression. At 77, Carlton also radiates a wisdom that only comes with years of reflection. He speaks openly about gratitude, about the privilege of a life in music, about the scars that shaped him into who he is today. Younger musicians don't just see him as a legend, they see him as a mentor, a man who embodies both artistry and humanity. His story is no longer just about what he played, but about how he lived. Larry Carlton's music isn't just notes, it's resilience, survival, and grace distilled into sound. And when audiences look at him today, they don't just see a guitarist, they see a man who has endured, who has triumphed, who has become something greater than even his most iconic solo could express. When you see Larry Carlton at 77, the first thing that strikes you isn't his age, it's his spirit. The silver hair, the lined face, the calm demeanor, they all tell the story of time, yes. But behind his eyes is the same fire that drove a young guitarist from Torrance to conquer the world's stages and studios. Today, Carlton continues to perform, record, and inspire. His shows are intimate, his solos deliberate, each note infused with the weight of his journey. There is no rush, no need to prove anything. He has already proven it all. What remains is expression in its purest form. And perhaps that is the most stunning truth about Larry Carlton today. Not that he is 77, but that he remains vital, creative, and deeply connected to his art. While many of his peers have retired or faded, Carlton still stands, guitar in hand, reminding us that music isn't about age, it's about soul.
What it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
And you know what I haven't mentioned when sharing about the other models?
Seeing him today is not just seeing a survivor. It's seeing resilience personified. It's gasping not because of how he has aged, but because of how he has endured, how he has transformed scars into songs, and how, even now, his guitar continues to speak louder than words. Larry Carlton's life is more than a career. It's a story of survival, reinvention, and artistry that spans 7 decades. At 77, he remains as captivating as ever, a living reminder that greatness is not just about talent, but about perseverance. What do you think? Does his journey inspire you as much as his music? Share your thoughts below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of legends who refuse to fade.